Alright, this is a viewer requested video about what would happen if America became a fascist theocracy police state with Trump as its dictator. Basically, what would happen if Trump gets elected for a second term, and what would happen in his 4 years in office with what he plans to transform the country into, with what he's been saying that he wants to do in his speeches on live TV, yada yada yada. All right, let's get started. Part 1, the fascist state. Let's start off with political transformation. The US government would likely undergo a significant shift towards a more authoritarian, centralized, and nationalist form of governance. Democratic institutions, checks and balances, and civil liberties would be severely eroded, with the concentration of power in the hands of a dominant political party or leader. The suppression of political opposition, dissident, and free speech would become widespread, with the potential for increased surveillance, censorship, and persecution of those deemed as enemies of the state. The transformation of America to a police state would slowly occur. There would be a secret police force that would be political police that would enforce fascist ideologies in everyday life. Those found to be members of the opposition would be under strict surveillance and would possibly be jailed or sent to internment camps. Part 2, economics. The economy might be shaped by corporatist policies where the government exerts a high degree of control over private industries and the means of production. This would be a key part of the policies of a white Christian nationalist regime. The government might take to nationalizing key industries entirely, such as manufacturing, transportation, and the fossil fuel industry. Such industries would be operated and owned directly by the state, and they would be seen as a means of state control and national pride, as Americans now are able to say that their goods are manufactured by Americans to be used for Americans rather than having to rely on foreign countries to manufacture our goods. Such policies would further work to increase the amount of extreme nationalism in the country. The state could prioritize self-sufficiency and protectionism, leading to reduced international trade and economic integration. Wealth and resources would be concentrated in the hands of a few select oligarchs, with limited social mobility and economic opportunities for the general population. Social and cultural consequences. Nationalism, xenophobia, and intolerance towards minority groups could become more prevalent, leading to marginalization, discrimination, and potential persecution of ethnic, religious, and cultural minorities, as well as LGBT minorities. Minority groups at best would be marginalized and discriminated against. At worst, they would be sent to concentration camps or outright deported. Traditional gender roles and suppression of individual freedoms could be enforced, with the state exerting control over personal and social choices. Homosexuality would be completely banned in the name of white Christian nationalism, and the rights, if there were any left, of LGBT people would be severely limited. Education and the media would likely be heavily influenced by the state's ideological agenda, shaping the narrative in public discourse. This agenda would be warped to push forward the agendas of white Christian nationalist ideology and a thinking that white Christian nationalists are a superior race of people. Foreign relations and global impacts. The U.S. might pursue an aggressive expansionist and militaristic foreign policy, potentially leading to conflicts and tensions with other nations. There is a chance that the United States would try to expand across the entire North American continent to make more space for its people, just as the Nazis did in World War II. The United States could seek to establish or maintain a sphere of influence, challenging the existing international order and alliances. Such new alliances that it creates would be based solely in white Christian nationalist ideology that would only be for exerting political power and furthering its own strength. Economic and diplomatic isolation from the global community might occur, as other nations distance themselves from a fascist regime. The U.S. could emerge as an economically independent nation that is not influenced by global economics due to its diplomatic isolation from the global community. Resistance and upheaval. There would likely be significant resistance and opposition from within the U.S., including civil disobedience, protests, and potentially armed resistance movements. Such movements of the opposition would be crushed by the force of a police state. The state would exert an extreme amount of control over the opposition. The risk of civil unrest, social upheaval, and even a civil war would increase as the population grapples with an authoritarian changes. The international community might impose sanctions, economic pressures, and diplomatic isolation in an attempt to contain the fascist regime and its influence. Part 2, the theocracy state. The erosion of the separation of church and state. The clear division between religious and government institutions will be dismantled, with religious doctrines and principles becoming the foundation of the country's laws and policies. Religious authorities and clerics would gain significant influence and power in the political decision-making process. These appointed religious figures would be an advisory body for the nation's leaders to take into adherence for the policies passed to make sure they align with the national religion. There would very likely be the establishment of a state religion or forced imposition of a dominant religious ideology on the population, that being Christianity. The restrictions on individual freedoms, personal freedoms and civil liberties such as the freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and freedom of choice would be severely curtailed. Legislation and policies would be shaped by religious dogma, leading to the suppression of religious minorities, LGBTQ plus individuals, and those who do not conform to the dominant religious norms. Strict moral and social codes would be enforced. No sex before marriage, and the Ten Commandments would be used in the nation's laws, with the state policing and regulating personal and private lives of citizens. The persecution of minority groups. Religious minorities, atheists, agnostics, non-believers, and those who practice different faiths would be facing increased discrimination, harassment, and potential persecution. Marginalized communities such as LGBTQ plus individuals, women, and ethnic minorities would be particularly vulnerable to discrimination and repression. The state's enforcement of religious doctrine could lead to systematic denial of rights and opportunities for these groups. These groups may even face deportation and be sent to concentration camps just for their beliefs. Limitations on education and science. The educational system would be heavily limited and influenced by religious ideology, with a potential focus on indoctrination rather than critical thinking and objective learning. Creationism would be taught in schools in place of evolution, and the state would take to outright banning the teachings of evolution altogether. Scientific research and curricula could and would be censored or altered to align with the dogmatic religious beliefs, limiting the advancement of knowledge and technological process. The progress of technology would be severely limited. Things such as stem cell research would be suppressed as they go against the idea of pro-life. Teachings that contradict religious doctrines, such as evolution or certain scientific theories, could be suppressed or prohibited entirely. The teaching of creationism in schools would be heavily enforced. Creationism would be taught in schools in place of evolution, and the state would take to outright banning the teachings of evolution altogether. The United States may fall deeply behind the rest of the developed world due to harsh restrictions placed on science and technology in respect to religious ideology. This could cause a technological and scientific backwater. Restrictions on economic and social development. Economic policies and decisions will be driven by religious principles rather than market-based considerations, potentially leading to inefficiencies and stagnation. Social welfare programs and public services could be influenced or controlled by religious institutions, with the potential for unequal distribution of resources. Resources could end up in the hands of the wealthy as opposed to those who really need it. The imposition of religious-based restrictions on certain industries, trade, and commerce could hamper economic growth and innovation. International isolation. The transition of a theocratic state could result in diplomatic isolation as other nations distance themselves from a government that disregards universal basic human rights and democratic principles. The country's foreign policy and international relations would be heavily shaped by religious ideologies, potentially leading to conflicts and tensions with secular or religiously diverse nations. The potential for economic sanctions or reduced global cooperation due to the erosion of democratic norms and religious intolerance would become widespread. Other nations may attempt to distance themselves from the U.S. due to its hostility of other religious ideologies and non-believers. Secular nations like Sweden may accuse Secular nations like Sweden may accuse us of religious bigotry and xenophobia. Part 3. The police state. The erosion of civil liberties. Fundamental rights and freedoms such as freedom of speech, freedom of press, and freedom of assembly would be significantly curtailed. This doesn't only apply to liberals and other political minorities. This applies to everyone. This is what conservatives get wrong about Trump's limits on freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and censorship. It would affect everybody. Internet censorship, surveillance, monitoring, control over the population, the expansion of law enforcement and intelligence agencies. everything would apply to all citizens, not just the political minority. Arbitrary arrests, detentions, and the silencing of political dissidents and the opposition will become widespread. The militarization of law enforcement. Police forces will become increasingly militarized with the use of military-grade equipment, tactics, and weaponry. The line between law enforcement and the military would blur, leading to the deployment of military personnel for domestic law and other order duties. Aggressive crackdowns on protests would be widespread. Demonstrations and civil unrest would also be widespread, with the potential for excessive use of force. A compromised judicial system. The independence and impartiality of the judicial system would be even more undermined than it currently is, with the potential for politically motivated prosecutions and unjust rulings. The rule of law will be selectively applied, with certain groups or individuals receiving preferential treatment or facing disproportionate punishment. This would affect disproportionately minorities and political opposition opponents. The due process of law, including the right to fair trial, could be eroded or disregarded entirely. The suppression of dissidents and minorities. Marginalized communities such as racial, ethnic, and religious minorities would face increased discrimination, harassment, and persecution. Whistleblowers, journalists, and activists exposing government abuses would be targeted and silenced. The state would employ tactics of intimidation, coercion, and violence to maintain control and suppress any form of resistance or opposition. Economic and social consequences. The concentration of power in the hands of the state and the military-industrial complex could lead to the diversion of resources away from social welfare and public services. Economic opportunities and social mobility will be very limited as the state exerts greater control over the economy and job market. The erosion of civil liberties and the climate of fear and repression could stifle creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. International isolation and degraded international reputation. The transformation into a police state could result in diplomatic isolation, economic sanctions, and the deterioration of international relations. The country's global reputation and influence would likely diminish, as it is perceived as a threat to human rights and democratic values. Potential for increased international pressure, intervention, and even sanctions to address the human rights abuses and the erosion of democratic norms. International relations would plummet, and nations would attempt to distance themselves from the United States and its lack of civil liberties. Credits. This scenario was adapted from the book Fascism in America, Past and Present by Gabriel D. Rosenfeld and Janet Ward. I use that book heavily for the creation of this slideshow, and I took a lot of points from the book and paraphrased a lot of things from the book. So I hope you enjoyed this slideshow and this alternate history scenario I made with what would happen if America transitioned into a fascist theocracy police state with Trump as its head of state. This is basically what Trump plans to do with America if he's elected again for a second term. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you next time for the next political science video.